About. Welcome to Evolution Hour, Troubles in Paradise, the methodology of creationism. Yay! Clickety clack, typewriters, analog clocks. Isn't that exciting? And our little WordPress.com, where there's an awful lot of free resources that are available for everybody to have. And now let me also get on our field here with our patrons. I am an old person, and it takes me a while to do all the stupid window sharings because I do not have that coordinated nearly as rapidly as I should. Okay, I think that's going in there. There's our patrons. Thank you very much, everybody who has helped the project and has stuck with it through thick and thin. It makes a huge difference each month, each week, and I will stay that down to whenever I'm not in a position to be able to say that anymore. So there's our opening little monologue. Now I can increase the screen. Yay! Isn't that wonderful? And then I can close off a few other little windows, and then I'll try to do a little blurb on the rocks were there advert at the end of the store if it works out to be the case. So anyway, we're continuing our happy little project, although that looks like snatitit in this. My camera seems to be backwards, and I'm not entirely sure whether that's what the hell's going on with that. I can't seem to put any indication to indicate why it would be that way, but oh well. If you, as far as I can tell, it's backwards when it's presented on the screen, so I don't know what the circumstances is on that, whether it's just a foible of our little pals at Restream or not. I don't know. You get what you pay for, and I'm not paying for anything here. So there we go. Anyway, we're now continuing into chapter 2, which is still continuing the process of them not really getting too much into technical literature yet. It's all about dinosaurs, remember, and how dinosaurs supposedly fit creation, and the deck stacking that they did in the first chapter, where basically they lay out their in-house discussions of young Earth creationism. Now they're dealing with some of the historic information about paleontologists who were just working out what dinosaurs were back in the 18th and 19th century. And I thought that was particularly interesting because of how carefully they're dangling around the data field. They happen to cite one really old paper from 1824 by William Buckland. He was the person who first described and named Megalosaurus, which is a really big lizard. The paper, in fact, hold on just a moment. Got a little thing I got to deal with. There we go. Thing cooking in the kitchen. Back again. I had a little thing cooking in the kitchen, making up iced tea, which I drink a lot of. And the alarm just went off as to when I needed to remove the tea bags out of the doodad. So there it is. There's a life that I have. Anyway, the Buckland paper turns out to be available open access. So I'm going to be putting a link in to that. And it's not there as a perfunctory piece of boring old minutia, but in fact, rather relevant, because Buckland's a really interesting guy. And he is, in fact, a really marvelous scientist. Just in the early days of the field where they were figuring out what the heck was going on, and of course, what drives creationists like Sarfati and Tay nuts is because it's in that period when it's becoming kind of clear that the big catch-all flood idea wasn't really working to explain much, and that there were extinct creatures in the past. How could that be in a perfect creation where all the animals were kept on the ark? And was there a time before the flood where stuff's going on that isn't really getting discussed in the Bible? And in that period, in the late 18th century and into the early 19th century, just at the time that little Darwin is growing up, before he starts running amok just a few years later with the Beagle voyage, and they're discovering more and more and more and more and more about this data field. It's becoming clear that the old cliched flood model, exactly the form that young Earth creationists are trying to reinvigorate on steroids in the 21st century, 100 years later, 200 years later, is not going to work. So on the one hand, we've got Buckland's 1824 paper, and I wanted you to see something relating to Buckland that was highly relevant. First, the creationist spin, and then some non-creationist spin. So Sarfati and Tay wave a paper from Mortenson, British scriptural geologist in the first half of the 19th century, part 1, which Sarfati and Tay list as 2018. No, it's a 1997 paper. Now, nothing wrong with that per se, but where the heck did they get this 2018 part from? It isn't even obvious that there was a... it wasn't even obvious that this was like when the posting was posted on the website at CMI. So where the heck are they getting this 2018 from? I think it's entirely possible that that's the date that Sarfati and Tay accessed it for the purpose of writing this book. And as can easily be the case with inattentive scholarship, that they can forget to look at the date of the thing, even though it's kind of obvious what the date of the thing is. Now, the reason why 1997 is kind of interesting, you'll be able to read the highly biblical scriptural version of Mortenson's attempt to pigeonhole everything into the young Earth creationist frame that Mortenson believes in. But it happens to be that 1997 is exactly the same year that a different paper by a non-creationist scholar was writing an appreciation of William Buckland and the foundations of taphonomy and paleoecology. And I'll be putting a link to that. Fortunately, it's available on ResearchGate, so you can look at all of this. And along the way, this paper by Boylan in 1997 happened to refer to a particular issue that's relevant to what we got going here. Buckland proposed the then astonishing interpretation that these were, they were talking about a cave full of hyena remains, by the way. This is why the show's topic is about gnawing hyenas. That these were not the remains of animals drowned in some great inundation, such as the biblical flood, but that the cave had been occupied as a den by a marauding pack of living hyenas in, quote, antediluvian times, unquote. And the kerfuffle that this caused in the scientific community at the time, grappling with this as the Sarfatis of 1824 were slogging along with their own viewpoint versus the new view that was being pioneered by the Bucklands of the world. Particularly that the idea that this was somehow antediluvian and that the predation model was in fact correct was borne out by subsequent evidence. So the two things that you can get from looking at Buckland and the Boylan piece on Buckland and the Mortenson piece going all theocratic spin and not really discussing much of the details, is how much detail Buckland and the Boylan paper did about the forensic bits and pieces and the reasoning process that Buckland went through and why it was so important and why it was a benchmark for how the sciences were going to be running. To add a cherry on top of this sundae, the fact is that Mortenson's article didn't mention anything at all about that hyena work, but Sarfati and Tay did, kind of, sort of. Very briefly alluding to the hyena remains issue, that accepting that it wasn't from the flood, they were okay with that, but disparaging Buckland's inference that all of that rock underneath that layer had to have represented enormous amounts of time, and it wasn't in the flood. It was all antediluvian material because it wasn't relating to the time when people were apparently living. So it's important that not a single technical reference is coming up in Sarfati and Tay in relation to all of this issue. It's purely theocratic gamesmanship. Not at all surprising. It's going to be interesting to see just how they're going to be spinning the technical literature that they do finally bump into. At the moment, we're running at about 1.2 sources per page, so it's a relatively low incidence. Judging from the looking of the size of their reference base, it's not exactly spectacularly thick with references, and it's not a ridiculously long book. So I'm not anticipating that average to get too much better than that as we move downstream. And the extent to, at the moment, they're heavily weighted towards creationist apologetics. That most of the sources they've cited so far have been creationist apologetics. Now, it looks like they're going to start waiving some more technical literature as they start moving into individual taxa. And remember, one of the main obsessions that I'm going to be thinking of is in relation to the ark encounter kind list, is do they really come down and weigh in on how many dinosaur kinds there are? I've already spotted that apparently there is no chart anywhere in the book that lists them. They list individual taxa they're discussing, but no attempt to just collate all of that into a listing of kinds. Almost like they don't want the reader to be easily able to make sense out of the material, even within their own framework. I would suspect that all of their baraminology pigeonholing is going to be within the family level for dinosaurs. And so there should be however many dinosaur families there are, air quotes, around 20. The problem will be what they would do to identify them. And so it's going to be fun to see how they burrow their way through the sauropods and the prosauropods and the psittacosaurids and all these other taxa, or to what extent are they just whittling things down? It looks like they're only mentioning about 60 taxa, which is more than the number of families in the dinosaurs, but way less than the variety of them, because some of the baramins theoretically would be in the same family and therefore in the same baramin. That would be the case for like sauropods, like diplodocids and apatosaurus and all of that bunch. But how are they in relation to mamenchosaurids and camarasaurids and all of these other aurids that are knocking around? So given the fact that the book is so recent, oh my, we'll want to see how much of that material is within a boundary layer of maybe 5 or 10 years from the publication date versus how much of it is older than that. So we're talking about 2011, 2010-ish. How much of it's pre-2010 versus post-2010? That's a good benchmark. And if not a lot of it is post-2010, leaving out the creationist ones, they've already cited a few recent creationist works and general discussion works that are more recent, but the technical literature, then that would indicate more about how building off of basically a very old database. And of course, some shoes I know are going to drop. They're going to have 2 bloody chapters on dismissing birds and their connection to dinosaurs. And already I know from some initial scanning, they're going to be bringing up Alan Fiducia. Duh. The question is, are they aware of the criticisms of Fiducia? Because remember, we're not writing this back in 2002 when Fiducia's arguments were initially being thrown out and then constantly repeated by people in the intelligent design movement as well as in creationism, and riffed on by Harun Yahya and thence to Kent Hovind, as I discovered in a 2018 example. No, we're way down the road to where it's just an objective statement of scientific scholarship that, boy, Fiducia's attempts to draw lines in the sand to keep dinosaurs and birds apart aren't working well with anybody outside of his little, very, very narrow camp. To some extent, it was Storrs Olson and the group at the Smithsonian versus the bunch at the American Museum of Natural History in New York with, yipes, trying to think of some of the Norrell and others that have been part of the group there. And that then gets into the whole issue of how selective they are with their scholarship. Now, So I do recommend that everybody that has a little bit of time, even though it's written in old 19th century ease, give a whack at the Buckland paper, and definitely in the Boyan analysis, because it's really a wonderful, anybody who's just interested in just the history of how disciplines develop, the Boyan paper is a really nice one that puts you into that perspective, and it's got just a wonderful bit of details on it. So part 2 of our little show relates to some more catchpool and the obsession creationists have with gee whiz. Gee whiz is, as you know, my terminology for what used to be called natural theology, which effectively is say, oh gosh, look at that. Isn't it complicated and wonderful and amazing? It had to have been designed. It must be the creator's handiwork. Boop. All done. And this obsession with that tends to follow a particular trajectory. There are some golden oldies that get repeated over and over and over again, eyes being an obligatory example. But the more active apologists tend to play gotcha games with cutting edge research, because typically if somebody is investigating an area where they're looking into a field and trying to figure out a new thing, ooh, isn't that an interesting topic? They typically in the early work, they're not really making any assertions about evolutionary relationships or the dynamics of how it came about from an evolutionary point of view or whatever. That comes later on as they settle down with more of the data field. And what tends to be the case is creationists that play gee whiz with work like this will not pay any attention to any of the subsequent work. It just is waved at you and then they run away. And you never get that comment again. They just move on to another subject. And relatively little of it ever gets retread down the road, especially if more people have done research on it to where it's being pulled more and more and more into the solid area of evolutionary thinking. So we're talking caterpillars today. And some caterpillars will roll up into a little ring and roll their way along so they can move a little faster. And a paper from 2011 by Lynn, which is available open access, so I'll be putting a link to that, was about an attempt to create a robotic roller that was based on what they could see the caterpillars do to better understand what was going on. Well, this is great fodder for the bunch. And Catchpool nicked a few of the sources that Lynn brought up. So he's seeing Lynn's paper and ferreting out little bits and pieces of stuff that Lynn brought up. So he's being a parasite in drawing off of research. Nobody in the creationist movement is doing any research on this, as far as I know, even though there are some bug people in the area. But basically, no. All of this is being done by regular scientists. Along the way, they've mentioned of some of the sources, and one of which is open access, a paper from 1997 by Brackenbury from Nature, which I'll be linking to. And that one relates to trying to work out the mechanisms of how the little caterpillars roll. So you can see that the issue had been a matter of curiosity since the late 1990s, and it had taken like a decade of analysis to kind of get to the point where they could make a little testing model with this robotic version. So clearly this is not an easy subject to deal with. Obviously, we would be talking about knowing the complete genomes of the caterpillars, knowing the selective pressures, to look whether or not this process occurs in particular lineages or not, and looking at the varying genetics that are involved in that. There's a lot of work that would have to be done to set up the stage to try to make an evolutionary argument about how this thing had developed and whether there was convergence involved versus novelty, and what genetic systems were the precursors of it, and all of that to get it. So what we've got is some old work, 90s era, the Lynn paper from 2011, and Catchpool is doing this in now, 2022. You think something might have happened between 2011 and now? Well, let's look into it. And it turns out that one of the authors on the Lynn paper was a fellow named Barry Trimmer. And his 2014 paper with Grithusen and some of the same collaborators on locomotion in caterpillars are showing that by 2014, they're just kind of starting to pin down more of the forensic details of how it goes about rolling and what might be involved from it. We're not yet to the stage of figuring out that full-blown evolutionary model because they're still working out the fiddly bits. What's intriguing about it that you might want to compare, just as you can compare the gloss in Mortenson with the detail that you were getting in the Boyan paper, you can compare Catchpool's tidy approach versus the detail that you're getting both in the Lynn paper and in the 2014 paper to see how much issues have to be brought up, and reminding yourself none of this is being done by creationists. So even being aware of the 2011 work, other than just going, Osh designed, whoop, nothing, no insight, no avenues of subsequent research are suggested by Catchpool's approach. Whereas you're getting the implications of directions that need to be explored in the evolutionary literature. It's like night and day world, again and again and again. This happens over and over in the fields. So that, I think, is an interesting little bookend about the dynamics of what does and doesn't go on in the creationist worldview. You get functionally the same kind of dynamic with I needed to get, do I have my little chat overlay on here? No. Okay, guess we've got no one viewing at the moment. 3 hours of the morning. We'll probably get some people catching up later on it. That the idea that anti-evolutionism is a model that isn't a model and that doesn't go anywhere is a thing that is amply borne out by centuries of thinking. That anti-evolutionists are drawing boundaries in the sand here, but no farther. We got to move it down here, but no farther. We got to move it down here, but no farther. To where now you find the Ark Encounter accepting things as creation that would have been considered heretical back in the Duane Gish era. Short-necked, okapi-like giraffe ancestors, Dinohippus as the ancestral horse kind, all the things that creationists of that Gish-Morris era would have insisted are impossible, absolutely impossible from a creationist perspective. Oops, well, they've accepted it. And the same thing with plate tectonics and all the rest. In cosmology, they're in a little bit tighter, awkwarder spot. Although they do try to square the circle. Your Lyles and others don't really dispute the data field. Good luck for them if they try. They're not saying the data aren't there. They just try to find ways to rationalize a way so that they can ram it into the Younger's cosmology somehow or other. But again, you're not getting anything much in the way of proactive development. You do have a little bit with Baumgartner, who came out with like a model of how rock formations and things supposedly fold and move. Although that doesn't work when you move to more serious detailing of plate tectonics, and so it doesn't really get involved much in the active geological realm. But when you look at more and more disciplines and see how little of the creationist literature bumps into them, and then how few of the creationists engage in any of those disciplines, and then look to see, is anybody in the regular disciplines really paying any attention to any of the stuff? And the answer is no. That the vast majority of geologists are blissfully unaware, really, that creationism is still like a thing. Quite a few of them have kind of the same attitude that scientists had 50 years ago, where they go, oh, there's creationists out there? Because they're just not bumping into their worldview much, unless they happen to be teachers that directly are bumping into students in class who are bringing up issues that require them to kind of think about it, and then they can start looking into it. So there's a certain degree to which there's a reinvention of the wheel, as the secular scientist, or whether they're religious or not, has to kind of ferret out what the creationist worldview is to better understand it, to deal with it in a pedagogical context. And but quite a few regular scientists will go through their entire career without the slightest indication of any of the creationist literature, and it doesn't get dealt with. You do find bits and pieces in lower echelon science publications where some people either know it's a creationist work and are trying to kind of slip it in on the side because they have a preference for that themselves, or they are not sufficiently versed in it to realize that the source is maybe suspect and they maybe shouldn't be citing it. But there's not a great deal of that. There's a handful. Once in a while, you can find a creationist paper getting cited for other than pointing out this is not right in the creationist realm. Some can be, in the geological frame, can be perfectly valid work in their own realm. There are examples of creationist geologists who are perfectly good at describing rocks, and they can be very, very anal retentive detailed on that. Andrew Snelling can be very, very careful on that. The rocks he picked up from the Grand Canyon that he had such a kerfuffle over, he doesn't offer a damn bit of new argument, even in terms of his own creationist position. He's just cataloging every little teeny rock crystal and all of that stuff. So he can be observational, but he can't be theoretical, in the sense of taking his model and really applying it to the point of where they're making serious and detailed testable predictions about the bigger world, so that somebody then can come along and build on that. Because there's no there. So there's no building. And they can only just kind of spin the wheel around and around and around and around and around over and over again with the same kind of superstructure. That's how it works. Well, we're about a half hour in, and no audience tonight, so everybody is presumably at home asleep or doing the things they are, or not yet up yet for those on the other hemisphere on our taco-shaped Earth. So let me go ahead and structure up our advert for the Rocks Were Their book. Okay, get that out of the way. Zippity-doo-dah. And we will put our advert in there. Come on. There we go. Yeah, it looks about right. And then we will hit the old play. The Rocks Were There, Volume 1. Have You Encountered Creationism? It's a right pretty book. Jackson Wheat and I, whose mug is on the back cover. I have my mug on the back end of Evolution Slam Dunk, so I figured we should get the press on the second one. I'm very pleased with the range of the work. It's, I would argue, is well worth the money, because you will learn so many things about so many creationists, so up to date, right up to the date of the publication date of the book. And the volume 2 will have exactly the same superstructure. That we've got the remaining chapters to deal with, which will be old click. We'll stop our little sharing there. That. Okie doke. Turn that off and back over to our little thing. Volume 2 will include material on the evolution of whales. As a beautiful case study, there's going to be more geology material. There's going to be a discussion of human evolution. There's going to be discussion with the creationist obsessions with eugenics and racism and the Nazis and all of that they always attempt to park in the orbit of Darwin, when things are way more complicated than that. And being a historian myself, I'm just happy as clam to discuss all of that historical nuance, just as I did today with Buckland and hyenas, as being perceived from the 1820s and how that led to other stuff. And then there will be just a bunch of really whiz-bang appendices that grew up from info boxes. Well, think in all the work, for those who have read Rocks for Their Volume 1, you'll know that you've got footnotes occasionally, not festoon. Most of the ones are internal textual references, but occasionally there's little digressionary details that pop up as footnotes. When that gets so big that it really makes too bulky of a footnote, it goes up as an info box that allows it to be segregated from the main text and able to spot it more directly. And if something gets to the point where an info box is really spreading across too many pages, I can go 3 or 4, but anything more than that becomes really too much. It deserves to have an appendix, and we'll bump the stuff over into there. And so the material on the flood legends and how creationists have misrepresented that, and material on their wacky rearrangements of chronology and manipulations of things on whether there were carnivory in the pre-flood world or not, and their evolution on that. That's another thing that I think is really funky to do when you look at older creationism versus contemporary creationism and the stuff that was book-based versus now internet, where things slide into little enclaves at AIG and CMI and ICR, which is becoming more and more moribund, becoming Guliuz's little game. And then, of course, the bottom feeder types, your Kent Hovinds and your secondary parasites like Eric Hovind and Standing for Truth, each one channeling aspects of varying one of these little camps. They're having more and more potential diversity and internal contradiction, which, because people track the little tracks and don't pay attention outside of the in-house, they're less likely to spot that. So we love to point out all that little material, and boy, the amazing little sidebars that one thing leads to another thing that leads to another, and the reminder that the kind of bad method that can lead somebody to be a doctrinal creationist inevitably tends to spill over into other areas that will have bad effects in terms of what politicians they vote for, in terms of how they view vaccines and climate change and so many other things, that one bad method to rule them all, unfortunately, is the case. And so we ignore this kind of stuff to our peril, because such people, if they have power, and far too often they do have power at state, local, and also all the way up, Donald Trump was enabling a lot of that stuff. He wasn't in there long enough to be able to do some serious stuff, and the creationism movement didn't have a chance or inclination. They were far too busy getting abortion overturned to really bother too much about overturning evolution in the schools. But I have no doubt that the ideologues in that range, in that Tony Perkins world, if they have half a chance and the power to do so, if they gain power at the federal level again, will potentially go in that awful direction. And we're going to be not going forward in science, but turning around and going backwards. And I'm one of those pesky little people that want to have things get better and improve knowledge, not turning into pre-1824 Buckland. So have fun reading all of that. Stay safe, cool if you're in the heat dome, and if you're in the spots in the world that people are shooting at you, don't bother about worrying about my YouTubes. That, although they might give you a laugh at least to while away some amusements in there, but pay attention to the priorities and do not accept any wooden penguins. So we'll catch you all next week with another installment of Will Jonathan Sarfati and Tay ever get to some technical literature that we can sink our teeth into, because we are inquiring minds and we intend to do that. So see you all next week. Au revoir.